You know what's not cool? Pop punk. In particular, the flavor of pop punk that really hit its stride in the late 90s and early 2000s. You know, a lot of stuff that sounds like this. I mean, the genre has been such a punching bag over the years that there's literally a meme dedicated to its defense. I know, that was popular like 5 years ago, but that's the point of this channel, celebrating stuff that's not cool anymore. So for this video, I wanted to provide a defense of pop punk. I wanted to take some common pop punk objections and see if I can manage them. So let's get right into it. First up, it's not real punk. Okay, I'll admit it. There was a time when I was much younger where I used to pile on people younger than me for liking pop punk because it wasn't quote-unquote real punk. And looking back, that was incredibly stupid.
Motherfucker, fuck the fucking world, and my new band is called Screeching.
First, we should establish that defining punk is probably the dumbest decision that anyone could possibly make. Not only is it paradoxical to put a formal definition on punk rock, it's also pretty ahistorical to say that punk rock and pop music are not interrelated. Let's take a look at the originators of the genre, the Ramones. Yes, the Ramones founded punk as a response to the bloated pop music scene of the 70s, but their aim was to replace 70s rock with their own brand of pop music. The Ramones wanted to be the Beatles. They just failed spectacularly at it, and in the process, basically created a genre. Beyond the Ramones, many of the other late 70s punk bands had pretty obvious pop sensibilities.
I just wanna love her like any other, what do I get?
Even the Pistols were pretty standard rock with some snarling vocals and a pretty self-destructive bass player. Now, of course, the sound of pop punk isn't the only thing that makes it fake punk. It's also the fact that this stuff got really big. These guys became pop stars in this era, and a lot of that had to do with the exposure they got after getting signed to major labels. A lot of bands got signed in the wake of Green Day. Of course, that would also mean that bands like the Ramones, the Clash, the Pistols, the Damned, the Buzzcocks, the Addicts, the UK Subs, Social Distortion, the Dead Boys, Bad Religion, X, and so many other with loads of punk credibility could never be considered real punk because they all spent time on major labels. And let's take it back a little bit. The original fad of 70s punk eventually morphed into new wave, and if you ask me, I hate new wave. It's awful. Will never defend new wave. But the remaining true believers left over from the 70s and some of the newer generation that was getting into it, they formed some really impressive scenes in the 1980s. And these scenes were completely divorced from the mainstream. The 80s was not a glamorous time for punk, but it was a foundational time for the entire subculture. And I really think it created a comparison point that future generations of the genre would have to live up to. And none of them really have lived up to that standard that was set in the 1980s. Now, I will make one caveat on this point. Let's go back to the Ramones. Their legendary art director, Arturo Vega, once explained that he felt the Ramones were more art than music.
I had this discussion with John a couple of times. I told him that I felt the Ramones were way better artists than musicians. To him, that was too artsy-fartsy an statement.
Now that might sound a little ridiculous, but just think about it for a second. There's a reason why the early punk scene was so well documented. I think it went beyond being a musical scene. It really was a study in culture. Apart from the music, punk was a visual medium that influenced fashion, provided provocative and deliberate performance, and even attached itself to various political and social movements. Admittedly, that's a little more interesting than the lifestyles of the rich and famous. I don't say that to delegitimize the genre, I just think it should be pointed out, but it really should not be a deal breaker in any way. I'd say the core difference is punk rock in its initial Big Bang phase really was culture, while pop punk kind of fits into a collage of other parts of culture of its time. But that's not really a reflection on the music in any way. The second charge, immature lyrical content.
Don't wanna grow up, I wanna get out. Hey!
So that first criticism I addressed, that comes mostly from the punk scene. The next couple of criticisms that I'm going to talk about here come from both the punk scene and from mainstream music in general. To a point, I get the judgment of pop punk being too immature coming from mainstream music critics. That makes sense. But if it's coming from the punk rock genre, you're going to have to do a little more convincing. Look, and I get there's some great intellectual punk bands. Bands like Bad Religion and Anti-Flag really played a valuable role in shaping the curiosities of a few generations. But if that's the limit of punk rock, we're left with a very narrow genre. Beyond that, let's face it, it's not like punk has ever really been an uber serious musical endeavor. Someone like Fat Mike might have resented all the bands that broke in the early 2000s, but if you're a NoFX fan and you hate pop punk for its immaturity, you might want to gain a little bit of introspection. Punk and youthful energy, they're pretty inseparable, no matter what form the music itself actually takes. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't agree with this criticism when it comes from mainstream music critics, but I do understand it a little bit. Because let's face it, music critics are no fun. And it's not just critics of popular music, I think all critics of popular culture only allow a certain subset of art to be considered good in popular discourse. But in particular, music critics really dig the serious stuff. I think grunge has really become the perfect illustration of what I'm talking about here. While undoubtedly a cultural force, grunge, like most other musical trends, had a rather short life within the mainstream. But if you ever read something like Spin or Rolling Stone, you would think that grunge was the only moment that rock ever took hold of the mainstream. Part of it is true, grunge was pretty awesome, and I don't want to denigrate grunge at all. In fact, without grunge, we probably wouldn't have had a pop-punk explosion in the late 90s. But the point I'm trying to make is that grunge at its really serious and drab tone appealed to the type of person that would eventually make a career out of writing about music. Genres like hair metal, pop-punk, third wave ska, nu metal, not so much. Also, there seems to be a trend in the last decade where music is a really subdued affair. Modern popular music all sounds like it could be played at a Starbucks or a Hallmark. And I get it, pop punk isn't exactly what you would call subversive, but it's also not highbrow either. For some context on this, I put a link in the description to a really good column by Steve Hyden. Yeah, I get it, I'm using a music critic to illustrate my point about my problem with music criticism. Work with me. Now, a lot of what I've addressed so far really deals with the tone of the music. It doesn't get into the lyrics specifically. But let's talk about those lyrics. We all know the pop punk tropes pretty well at this point. Broken relationship, the inability to fit into popular society, difficult transition into adulthood, and the desire to leave your hometown are all the main components of the pop punk sauce. But these themes, they're not really unique to pop punk. They're not really unique to pop music either. They're really staples of music. Pop punk, to its credit, just really perfected these themes. Like it or not, music is always going to belong to the kids. Like I did before, I'll offer a caveat. It's probably really difficult to get into pop punk if you're not in some form of your youth. Like I could totally imagine someone being at the age maybe 35 in 2002 and hearing a song about being just a kid and being really turned off by the entire genre and just thinking it's not for you. Which, to be honest, it's probably not. Even personally, I have a hard time getting into newer pop punk acts. And it's not really an indictment or a judgment of the quality of the music. It just doesn't move me. I think it's meant for someone of a certain age. And what's ironic about that is I can hear stuff by Mess or Newfound Glory that comes out in 2020, and I think it's great. And that might not be a fair judgment by me, but I'm into those bands. Also, as soon as a pop punk band wants to say that they put out their mature album, that's usually when yeah, pop punk wears its immaturity on its sleeve. But it's not unique to the genre. And even if it is, so what? The third charge, simple music. Look, at some point I had to come to terms with the fact that I cannot play music. That's why I like talking about it on YouTube. But when I do feel like hanging out and playing some bass or some guitar, it's usually some sloppy punk. And it's usually a blast. Nobody will ever argue that pop punk is some complex form of music that you need to go to Berkeley for like a decade to master. But arguing about the simplicity of the music really misses some of the value that it gives to music as a whole. I don't have any hard data on this, but I'm going to guess that there's a whole generation of kids that picked up instruments because they wanted to emulate Mark, Tom, and Travis. And of course, as we know, pop punk is, well, pop. And if you're a punk purist, get the fuck out of here with this one. Have we forgotten that so much of the appeal of punk is the democratization of the music? Let's go back to that 80s scene. Some of the appeal of that 80s scene was that punk rock was this art form that could be reproduced by those who consume it. And that's not to say punk is devoid of great musicians, far from it. Guys like Matt Freeman and Josh Freese would strongly disagree with that sentiment, and good luck trying to replicate Johnny Ramone's downstrokes. The point is, we all kind of want to do it. Pop punk is simplistic, and music is better for it. There's a reason why so many modern artists often cite pop punk bands as such big influences on them, and it's not because they're trying to replicate pop punk in the music they make, well, not all of them. But it's because it's something that draws in young people. It makes it seem like something you can do, and eventually you start creating your own art. And last up, the dark side. This one's not so fun. In the latter half of the 2010s, pop punk was not only dead from a musical standpoint, but it was also exposed as a very dark place. a lot of guys within the genre were accused of some pretty awful stuff. And obviously, I'm not going to defend any of these guys just because they wrote some songs that I really liked when I was a kid. And in a lot of ways, pop punk does seem like a perfect zone for these things to occur. It's a scene where attractive men are celebrities and large chunks of the fandom are young females. However, if Me Too and other social movements have taught us anything, it's that this is a problem that's not unique to any single industry. Sexual misconduct is a societal problem that needs to be rectified. But on a little bit of a lighter note, I will say this. When a lot of this stuff went down, there was a ton of writing that came out of this. Some stuff that was critical media, kind of feminist in nature. And I gotta say, I really liked reading and engaging with this literature. A lot of it made some valid points. But that doesn't mean that pop punk needs to be canceled. In fact, by that standard, we just wouldn't have any music that was made in like the last 50 years. Yes, misogyny is present in pop punk, but it's not exclusive to the genre. I guess to wrap things up, I just want to say this. Here's the bottom line with all of these and some other pop punk criticisms. It's okay to like whatever you want. Tastes are tastes, and it's foolish to force people to like or dislike the same art that you do. And it's really dumb to shame people for what they like as being immature or something of the past. And it's really that simple. It's okay to say you don't like something, or it's not your thing, or it's not for you, or you simply just don't have a connection with it. I guess it just gets old when so many bad faith arguments are hurled at a single genre that people honestly probably don't care about that much, but they take any reason to just pile on it because it seems like something from the past that was so uncool. And I think that's kind of lame. But hey, you do you. Talk to you next time.
Really, it's just music after all.